Hey, this is Jamie from Stillmeyer Games, and today I'm going to be talking about cooperative games, specifically difficulty scaling in cooperative games. And I might mention one competitive game, but mostly this will be cooperative. By difficulty scaling, I'm referring to setting the difficulty of the game. So if you're playing a cooperative game, some cooperative games, I found there aren't that many of them, but some just have one way to play. There's no way to scale how difficult the game is. But most cooperative games have different levers you can pull or adjust so that it becomes easier or harder depending on your experience with the game. I ran a poll recently with Stillmeyer ambassadors to ask them what they thought about difficulty scaling in cooperative games, if they actually used the scaling or if they always just went with the standard mode, even if there were scaling options. 52% of people said that they selectively consider difficulty scaling. So selectively. So every now and then they'll consider it. 32% that said they frequently use it. So almost every game they'll decide, okay, I want to be a little harder, a little easier. And 16% of people said they rarely or never use difficulty scaling. So based on this input, there is 32% is a significant number of people who frequently use it, and 52% is significant as well. But it was something on my mind a lot recently because of Viticulture World, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Like, how important is it to have multiple levers versus maybe just one lever or a few levers? So we'll talk about that in a second. Even as I'm talking here, I thought of another game that I want to add to the list. I don't want to forget about it, and I've already forgotten the name. So we'll come back to it later, hopefully. So I'm going to go through a bunch of different categories today, and I wanted to start out with a quote from an ambassador about one specific game that I think does difficulty scaling really, really well on many different levers. And I really like this quote. The ambassador was talking about Spirit Island, a game that I'll talk about a little bit later. And the ambassador says, Spirit Island has so many options, from spirit difficulty to tweaking invader settings to the different scenarios with many levels of scaling. And this is the key part of the line that I really, really liked. I can introduce it to just about anyone and adjust it accordingly. I really like that last part of the line because I love when games can be as welcoming and inclusive as possible to a broad range of people. And that doesn't always mean people who are new to the game. I think that's really the key that opened me up, I think, a little bit more to the idea of difficulty scaling, because difficulty scaling can actually make a game more welcoming to someone who already knows it quite well and has already played it a lot. And they may not otherwise want to play it unless there is a lever to pull to make it more difficult. That makes it more welcoming to an experienced gamer who wants a challenge. I hadn't thought about that, but I also like the reverse side of welcoming newcomers into a game and adjusting those levers down pretty low to make it an easier experience for those newcomers. I really like that quote, and I think Spirit Island does that really well. I'll talk about that more in one of the categories coming up. So the first category is adjusting starting resources. And an example for this is Atlantis Rising. And I should mention, many of the examples on this list apply to multiple categories, but I'm going to highlight one aspect of that game. Atlantis Rising 2nd Edition. It's been a while since I played this game. A beautiful game, really well designed, simultaneous worker placement cooperative game. And in Atlantis Rising, you can adjust, I just looked it up yesterday, you can adjust, what is it? I think it's the number of cards that you get at the beginning of the game. But I'm blanking out. It might be the number of workers. I'm sorry that I'm forgetting it right now. I just looked it up yesterday. But you were adjusting something at the beginning of the game, a starting resource that often players get, each player gets, or all players share, that helps make the game easier or harder. And I think I'm starting off with this one because I think it's not necessarily the easiest to implement. It is the easiest for players to implement because they can set it and forget it from then on. And a lot of these things in here are things that you choose at the beginning of the game and that you don't have to think about for the rest of the game. But many of them are like, if one that I'll mention later is you choose a more difficult boss to battle against. And even though you don't have to remember that that's the boss for the rest of the game, that they're clearly there on the board, you do have to run that boss. And so oftentimes the more difficult bosses are also more complex. So you have more complexity throughout the game, opposed to just starting with one more worker than normal to make the game a little bit easier or a little bit harder. It's something that you don't have to think about. It doesn't add complexity, just makes the game easier. And so I love the idea of just starting with a few more resources at the beginning of the game to make a game easier, or starting with fewer to make it harder. I really like that idea. And even though I'm not giving a good example about Atlantis Rising does do this. The next category is character strength and complexity. Oh, and I just remembered the game that I wanted to mention later, so I will, let me write that down. Okay, so the next category is character strength and complexity. So this is one that we see a lot in terms of the way you're choosing a character, and I love it when games show you how difficult or easy that character is to play. Some cooperative games that do this really well are Marvel Champions and Spirit Island. Spirit Island has the different spirits with vastly different abilities, vastly different complexity levels. And I've only played Spirit Island maybe 4 or 5 times, and so I am still, I would say, a novice at Spirit Island. I often gravitate towards the easier to run spirits. And they often make the game... They make the game a little bit easier as a whole, but they also just make it easier for my experience as a player, whether or not we're playing against a very difficult invader set. Marvel Champions has a similar thing, similar complexity, where they have different characters that are easier to run or more difficult to run, more complex. And I think this is great. I think that this is a great category, not just in terms of the difficulty, but also just in terms of each player's individual mental overload. How much new information can they handle? How much information do they want to handle on an ongoing basis throughout the game? Because that alone can make a game easier or more difficult. And I think Marvel Champions and Spirit Island do this really well. The third category for difficulty scaling is bag or deck construction. Again, this is some setup stuff that you do at the beginning of the game, and then you don't have to think about it for the rest of the game. But I think this is a really, really handy way to offer difficulty scaling in your game. However, it does make setup a bit more complex. So there's a pro and a con to this. Some examples are Arkham Horror LCG, which is a bag of mostly bad tokens, but a few good tokens. So you can mix up the number of bad tokens and good tokens in that bag. Or Pandemic. Pandemic has its infamous isn't the right word, probably famous because a lot of games use this system of a deck where you separate it into a certain number of piles, 4 or 5 piles, and you put different bad cards into each of those piles, and then you don't shuffle all those piles together. You shuffle each pile individually and then put each pile on top of that. Something that I forgot a few times I played Pandemic. It is crucially important to play that way, but it does require some additional setup steps. The number of the number of bad thing cards that you put into a deck or into a bag can make the game more difficult. You can pull them out to make it easier. And I think that's a great way to offer difficulty scaling in games. It just makes setup a little bit more laborious if you do it that way. The next category is scenario or mission selection. I briefly mentioned this before for Spirit Island, but some examples that I have here, I have some visual examples finally. Viticulture World. Viticulture World has it has 7 different continents inside the box where you are playing kind of not really against the continent, but you're playing in the continent, and each continent is completely asymmetric. And in the rulebook, we offer a rating scale to show how difficult it is to win within each of those different continents. There's also a promo continent that you get if you order Viticulture World directly from us. That is even easier because Viticulture World is difficult. It is a difficult cooperative game. And even the introductory scenario is fairly difficult. It'll push you to do some things that you're not used to doing in Viticulture. And but you can scale it up from there. And so the main lever for difficulty scaling in Viticulture World is choosing which continent you're playing within, and that can make the game more difficult or easier. One other thing that you can do, one official variant that we've added on our website, if you're looking for another lever to pull, is in Viticulture World, you win by each player getting 25 victory points and all players collectively getting 10 influence. And the lever you can pull if you want to make it a little bit easier is to say that each player only needs to get to 20 victory points. This is a different category that I'll talk about a little bit later. Kind of setting the goal is a category, but I wanted to mention that while I'm talking about Viticulture World. The other modern classic, hopefully Viticulture World will become modern classic, but the other one that's definitely a modern classic, The Crew. The Crew offers 50 different missions that you can go on. And the main way you play The Crew is that you sit down and you say, okay, we're starting with mission 1. Once you beat mission 1, which doesn't take very long, you'll play mission 2, and then so on. And they get more and more difficult. Some of them, many of them just say that you have to complete more tasks or complete different tasks that scale up in difficulty. But you don't have to start at mission 1. That's the great thing about the crew. If you've already played the crew a bunch, you might start at mission 10 or mission 20 or mission 30. You can start wherever you want. And so you can really scale it up. I mean, 50 different missions. You have a ton of different flexibility as to how difficult that you want to go depending on the mission itself. So the crew often and Viticulture World both often offer scenario and mission selection as its difficulty scaling mechanisms. Next, we have antagonist selection. So if you're playing a style of cooperative game where it's you against something bad, some opposing force. Some examples of this are Sentinels in the Multiverse, Cthulhu Death May Die, and Horrified. I haven't played Horrified, but I've heard great things about the monster scaling in that. I played Cthulhu Death May Die once, and so I don't have multiple monsters to compare it to, but that is something that you can choose to do. I have played Sentinels in the Multiverse many times, and they have a great, especially in the new version, the definitive version, they have a great scaling system to show you how difficult, how complex each of the bad guys are. And they can make a big difference in how difficult the scenario is to complete. I think that's a great way. Change the antagonist itself. If you're struggling against the AI, if it's that style of cooperative game, offer different characters, different styles of characters, antagonists, in terms of their difficulty levels. And how you actually implement their difficulty, how do you actually make them more difficult? Part of it is design. Part of it is playtesting, though, and seeing, okay, if we've playtested each of these characters 20 times, and this character, people have won against this character 15 times, but they've only won against this character 5 times, that data is, I think, pretty important as you determine what the difficulty ratings are for those different antagonists. The next category is AI power level. So this is similar to antagonist selection, but I'd say there's a little bit of overlap here. One of the examples that I gave that could have been in the previous category is Shards of Infinity, Shadow of Salvation, one of my favorite expansions to a game. This is a cooperative expansion to a competitive game. In Shards of Infinity, there's a very, very small change here. There's a variant where you can simply basically the monsters, the bad guys that you're fighting against level up faster. And this is actually the difference between antagonist selection. You're not actually choosing a different antagonist in Shadow of Salvation. Rather, you're saying, okay, when we get to this bad guy, we will make it more difficult by making them level up faster. That's the difference here. That's the difference. You're not selecting a different antagonist. You are making a specific antagonist more difficult, or making the AI more difficult. Another huge example of this is Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven has many different levers that you can pull, even on a enemy by enemy basis, where there's this double-sided card. It's really, if you haven't seen Gloomhaven, I think it's a really nice implementation where you have these double-sided cards with 8 different levels in total, so 4 on each side. And you slide the card into a little envelope that only reveals the current difficulty level. And typically you'll say, okay, we're going to play this scenario at level 2. And all of the bad guys in that scenario, they all have their own cards that I just described. All the bad guys in this scenario, you can set them to level 2. But you don't have to do that. You could set them at different levels. And the game might even instruct you to say, okay, this creature is at level 3. This creature is at level 4. So you can just go by what Gloomhaven tells you to do. But you can also always level them all up as much as you want, or level specific characters up, or not characters, but the AI or AI controlled characters as much as you want. So I think Gloomhaven does that really, really well. And it's very simple. You just have to look at a single number or a single description on the part of that envelope that is showing. Next up, we have AI complexity. So one more thing related to the AI. How complex is the AI? I've referred to this in a few of the other categories, how it's not necessarily always about difficulty, but also just about how hard it is to run the AI itself. And Pandemic Iberia, which I haven't played, but someone had a good example for this. In Pandemic Iberia, the diseases can have special abilities. So the standard way to play Pandemic Iberia, I believe, is that you don't give special abilities to each of the diseases. But if you want to make it more difficult, you can do that. You can say, okay, they each have a special ability now that we need to manage. Makes it not only harder, but also more complex to understand how these diseases work, how they're going to spread, how they'll interact with us as players. So I think that's another lever to pull in difficulty scaling. Next category is timer and goal quantity. So 2 games that I haven't played in this category are Dead Men Tell No Tales. I haven't played that one. That one apparently, let's see if I can find my notes. So that one, I believe you need to access a certain number of treasure chests to win this game. And so you could access like X treasure chests. That might be number of players, I think is X, or X plus 1 or X plus 2. So you are deciding how difficult the goal is itself. What is the timer for the game? What is the quantity of things that we need to do or accomplish to say that we won this game? Cuphead apparently does this as well with a timer. Cuphead is a real-time cooperative game, and so you can set the timer shorter or longer. So adjusting the time of a real-time game can make a difference. And then the example I have is Shipwreck Arcana. Wonderful little cooperative puzzle game. To win Shipwreck Arcana, you need to solve a certain number of kind of puzzles. You have to get a certain number of points through solving these puzzles. And that is a very easy lever to pull. You can either say, okay, this game, we need to solve 3 of these to win. That would be very easy. Or we need to solve, I think 7 is the max. We need to solve all 7 before time runs out. There's a set timer in the game. It's not real time. But I think that's a great way to do it, to set the goal quantity, the number of things that you need to do before you can win, or how long that takes, is a great difficulty lever to pull. Another game that I have here is Sleeping Gods. So Sleeping Gods has a few different modes you can play in, and so I'm putting this in the category of what the lose condition is in the game itself. And I think it often refers to the mode that you're deciding to play. In Sleeping Gods, here, I'll read it here. So you have normal mode and you have brutal mode, and I believe there is also an easy mode that you can play as well. In normal mode, if you're defeated, so if all your crew's health are reduced to 0, or the ship takes 11 damage, those things can cause you to lose. But in normal mode, you don't actually lose the entire campaign. That would be brutal mode. And brutal mode says the game is more realistic and in complete failure when you are defeated. The campaign ends and you must reset the game and start a new campaign to play again. So the stakes are the highest in brutal mode. I don't know if many people play that way though, because if you've already spent 10 hours in a campaign, do you really want to completely restart? That reminds me a little bit of Seventh Continent, where if you die, you have to go all the way back, losing maybe hours of work that you spent on it. In normal mode, instead, all crew are reduced to 0 health, and then you move to the nearest port and remove all crew damage. Discard 6 event cards, so you're speeding up the timer of the campaign in normal mode. There's still a consequence to losing, which I think is important. Or if the ship has 11 damage, then you'll move to the nearest port and remove all ship damage. Discard 6 event cards. So you're speeding up the campaign. You're losing time within the campaign because you're taking that time to heal or repair your ship, essentially. So you have these different modes of the game, and I think in easy mode, the consequences are even smaller. I haven't played that way. I think we played in normal mode when we played our first campaign. But yeah, changing the lose condition itself and having these different modes of play, I think works well for games like Sleeping Gods. We have a little game called Hanabi. In Hanabi, there are some levers that you can pull within the game itself. There are some cards that you can put in or remove from the deck of cards. But I wanted to mention one thing that with Hanabi, that the final result is the difficulty scaling itself. So you don't have to play a Hanabi in any different modes itself. You can play it the normal way every time, but the difficulty in Hanabi, and it really doesn't, this is a bit of a misnomer because you're not actually changing the difficulty of the game. Rather, you're changing what you are striving for. Because in Hanabi, the win conditions are variable. Let me see if I can find them in the rulebook here. So at the end of the game, okay, so if you have 5 points at the end of the game, you've done horribly, you're booed by the crowd. But if you have 25 points, and there are lots of different tiers in between, I won't read them all. At 25, you were legendary. Everyone is left speechless, stars in their eyes. And so the difficulty is the outcome itself. So you haven't changed how hard the game is. You're changing how much pressure you're putting yourself on to get as many points as possible at the end of the game. Sleeping Gods actually does something like this too at the end of the campaign, but much shorter game here in Hanabi. But I like this. I have to be honest and say that even though this is outside the realm of normal difficulty scaling, I really like the idea that the difficulty emerges at the end of the game. But you have that pressure throughout the game. You're saying, okay, we are striving for this many points. We're going to go all out to get this many points. And how well you do is determined by a scale at the end of the game rather than a set win or lose condition. So that's Hanabi. And last, I have player-specific scaling. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Kind of when you choose your own character in a game, you might choose one player might choose a really easy character, another player might choose a really hard character. That's one way you can do it. But I have two non-cooperative examples to share here of player-specific scaling. One is nations. In nations, each player can choose how difficult they want the game to be for them. And I think this is really, really clever in a game that is fairly punishing like Nations. Because in Nations, it's a civilization building game, and bad things can happen to you, and do happen to you on a regular basis. And kind of your threshold for mitigating those bad things, you can adjust by choosing how difficult the game you want it to be for yourself. So if you have a brand new player, you can make it really, really easy or easier for them. It's still a very competitive game for them, but you can make it easier for them. If you've played Nations a bunch, you can make it more difficult for you. So I think that's really clever. Even in a competitive game, Nations does that. The other game that comes to mind is Mind Management. So in Mind Management, it is a one versus many game. And even though it isn't a campaign game, every time you play, the game gives you the option of opening a box. And in that box is something that can make it more difficult for you if you won, or easier for the opponent if you lost. So if you are the player, if you play the hidden role and you win, I believe either you or your opponents open a box at the end of that game, making the next game easier for the group, so the group who's playing against the hidden leader. And vice versa. I think this is a really clever scaling system where if you have a one versus many game, it doesn't have to be a campaign game. You can still adjust the difficulty and add complexity as you play, especially if you're playing with the same group, based on who is winning or losing every time you play. I think this could work great for a team game, works great for a one versus many game. I thought that was really, really clever. So yeah, I think that's around 10, 11 categories of different ways that you can scale difficulty in various, mostly cooperative games. I have other games that I didn't mention here that I haven't played, but I didn't feel confident speaking about those games. Like Mage Knight was mentioned, Too Many Bones. I haven't played those games, Sword and Sorcery. But feel free to talk about some of your favorite examples of difficulty scaling in games, especially if it's a game that you often change the difficulty on. I'd love to hear some of those examples in the comments below. Thanks.